On a gray morning in the winter of 977, in the marshlands near the Danish coast, a woman was led to a place where the earth gave way to water, and the water gave way to something older still. She was perhaps 60 years old. She had outlived 2 husbands, seen 4 of her sons become kings, watched 3 of them die violently, and orchestrated more deaths than any saga bothered to count. Her hair, which the sources describe as beautiful even in age, was unbound. Her hands, which had mixed poisons and cast runes and held the heads of dying men, were tied. The men who surrounded her were not her own. They belonged to Harald Bluetooth, king of Denmark, and they had been given specific instructions about what was to happen next. The place they had brought her was a bog. Not a lake, not a river, not even a proper swamp. A bog, that strange liminal geography where solid ground becomes a lie and the boundary between the living world and whatever lies beneath it grows thin enough to cross. The Norse had names for such places. They had rituals for what happened in them. And in that moment, Gunnhild, who had been called Mother of Kings, who had been called the most beautiful woman in Norway, who had been called sorceress and queen and murderer and worse, understood exactly what kind of death had been prepared for her. They did not grant her the honor of a blade. Her name was Gunnhild. The sagas call her Gunnhild Konunga Modir, Gunnhild, Mother of Kings. But this title, which sounds almost gentle, almost maternal, was not a term of endearment. It was a warning. Because the kings she mothered were instruments of her will, and the will they served was one of the most relentless, most calculating, most politically lethal forces the Viking Age would ever produce. For 4 decades, from the fjords of Norway to the wind-scraped islands of Orkney, from the courts of Denmark to the shores of Northumbria, Gunnhild moved through the political landscape of the 10th century like a blade through water, silent, patient, and absolutely without mercy. She married Eric Bloodaxe, the most terrifying warrior king of his generation. She bore him at least 9 children, including 4 who would wear crowns. She drove her husband's rivals into exile, then hunted them across oceans. She was accused of practicing satyr, the darkest and most forbidden form of Norse magic, the kind that touched death itself. She was said to have killed with curses as easily as her husband killed with steel. And when Eric fell at the Battle of Stainmore in 954, leaving her a widow in a hostile land, she did not retreat into grief or fade into the margins of history the way royal widows were supposed to. Instead, she gathered her sons, returned to Norway, and spent the next 2 decades engineering their rise to power while systematically destroying everyone who opposed them. The body count she left behind is quite literally incalculable, and yet her story has never been told at length. Not like the sagas told Ragnar Lothbrok's story, or Rollo's story, or the stories of the kings she made and unmade. Gunnhild appears in those narratives as a supporting character, a villain, a catalyst, the woman behind the throne, the hand that moves but is never moved. The sagas that mention her are hostile. The chroniclers who recorded her deeds were her enemies or descended from her enemies. For 1,000 years, her memory has survived primarily as a cautionary tale. This is what happens when you let a woman touch power. But the evidence is there, scattered across 6 sagas and a handful of foreign chronicles waiting to be assembled. And when you assemble it, when you read past the misogyny in the folklore and the obvious propaganda, what emerges is not a witch, not a demon, not a cautionary tale. What emerges is an operator. A woman who understood the brutal mathematics of 10th century Scandinavian politics better than almost anyone else alive, and who played that game with a ferocity that terrified men who spent their lives surrounded by violence. This is the story of how she did it. This is the story of how she was unmade, and this is the story of the bog, of what it meant that Harald Bluetooth chose that death for her, in that place, in that way. It is also necessarily a story about what we cannot know. The sources for Gunnhild's life are extensive by early medieval standards and almost uniformly hostile. The primary texts are the Icelandic sagas, particularly Egil's saga, Heimskringla, Fagerskina, and the various kings' sagas that trace the lineages of Norwegian rulers. These were written between the 12th and 14th centuries, roughly 200 to 400 years after the events they describe, by authors who were culturally and politically aligned with Gunnhild's enemies. The Icelanders who preserved the sagas were, in many cases, descendants of the men Gunnhild had driven into exile. Their perspective is encoded into every sentence they wrote about her. There are also foreign sources: the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, various Frankish annals, scattered Irish records, that mention Gunnhild or her family from outside the Norse cultural frame. These are useful precisely because they do not share the saga's particular hostilities, though they have biases of their own. Christian chroniclers describing pagan politics were not neutral observers. What the sources agree on is remarkable. Gunnhild was powerful, Gunnhild was dangerous, Gunnhild lasted. What they disagree on is almost everything else. Her parentage is disputed. Her magical abilities are variously presented as literal fact, metaphorical shorthand for political cunning, or Christian slander against a pagan woman. The exact number of her children varies by text. The circumstances of her death are preserved in multiple versions, some of which contradict each other. Modern historians have done what they can with this material. Archaeological evidence, particularly from the period of Eric Bloodaxe's rule in York, provides independent verification that some of these people existed and did roughly what the sagas say they did. Linguistic analysis of the saga texts themselves has revealed layers of composition, earlier sources embedded in later tellings, suggesting that at least some of the traditions about Gunnhild reach back to genuine 10th century memory. But the bog that swallowed her body has never been found. No grave goods mark her passage. No runestones commemorate her reign. What we have is the echo of her life in the words of men who hated her, refracted through centuries of retelling, contaminated by folklore and propaganda and genuine supernatural belief. We must read these sources the way one reads a hostile witness in court, extracting truth from testimony designed to obscure it, watching for the moments when the bias reveals itself, attending to what is accidentally admitted rather than deliberately stated. What follows, then, is a reconstruction. It is as honest as the sources allow. Where we know, I will say what we know. Where we are guessing, I will say we are guessing. And where the sources themselves seem to be lying, where the hostility becomes so thick that it paradoxically illuminates what it is trying to hide, I will try to show you what lies beneath. Begin where the sagas begin, with a girl in the far north, in a place where the rules were different. The traditional account, preserved in Egil's saga and echoed in other texts, holds that Gunnhild was born among the Sami, the indigenous people of the Arctic North. According to this version, she was not Norwegian at all, but a foreigner, raised in the dark forests and treeless tundra beyond the frontier of Norse settlement. She was sent to study magic with 2 Sami shamans, learning the arts of cedar from masters of the craft. When the young Prince Eric found her, she was living in a hovel in the wilderness, already possessed of powers that would make her the most feared woman of her age. This version is almost certainly propaganda. The Sami were, to medieval Icelanders and Norwegians, the ultimate other, exotic, frightening, associated with the wildest and most forbidden forms of magic. Placing Gunnhild's origins among them served a specific narrative purpose. It made her alien, made her powers explicable through foreign contamination rather than native cunning, and conveniently erased her actual family connections. If Gunnhild learned her sorcery from Sami shamans, then her power came from outside the Norse world rather than from within it, a comforting thought for men who found themselves unable to explain how a woman had dominated their politics for 4 decades. The more reliable sources tell a different story. Snorri Sturluson, writing in Heimskringla in the 13th century, identifies Gunnhild as the daughter of Össur Toti, a powerful Herseer, local chieftain, from Hålogaland, the northernmost region of settled Norway. This parentage is prosaic, politically coherent, and entirely unprovable, but it fits the pattern of what we know about Viking Age marriage alliances. Eric Bloodaxe was the favorite son of Harald Fairhair, the first king to unite Norway under a single crown. He would not have married a nobody. He would have married a woman whose family connections strengthened his claim to power, whose relatives could field warriors when the succession wars began, whose bloodline could produce heirs that other powerful families would recognize. Gunnhild, daughter of Ozur Toti, fits this model. Gunnhild, magical waif discovered in a Sami hovel, does not. But notice what the Sami origin story preserves even as it lies. The admission that Gunnhild was educated, that she possessed knowledge and abilities that set her apart, that she was marked from the beginning as someone destined for more than ordinary life. The propaganda cannot quite erase the underlying fact. It can only relocate its explanation to a more comfortable distance. The truth we can extract is this. Gunnhild was raised in the north, in a region where Norse and Sami cultures overlapped and influenced each other. She came from a family powerful enough to marry into the royal line, but remote enough from the centers of Norwegian politics to be framed as foreign by later writers. She was intelligent, ambitious, and educated in ways that made her contemporaries uneasy. And at some point in the early 10th century, the exact date is lost, she married Eric Haraldsson, called Bloodaxe, and her life became entangled with the most violent family in Scandinavia. To understand Gunnhild, you must first understand what she married into. Harald Fairhair, Eric's father, was the man who created Norway. Before him, there was no Norway, only a collection of petty kingdoms and independent chieftainships strung along the western coast of Scandinavia, separated by mountains and fjords and ancient rivalries. Harald unified them. The process took decades. It involved battles, betrayals, strategic marriages, and the exile of countless families who refused to submit. By the time it was finished, sometime around 872, Harald controlled more territory than any Norwegian ruler before him. But Harald's solution to the problem of succession created a problem that would outlast him by centuries. He had many wives, many concubines, and many sons. The sources disagree on the exact number, but estimates range from 12 to 20. And while Norse custom allowed for polygamy and multiple lines of descent, it provided no clear mechanism for choosing among those lines when the patriarch died. Each son had a claim, had a osobe. Each son had a mother with her own family connections, her own network of supporters, her own reasons to believe her child should inherit. The kingdom Harald had built was designed to fragment the moment his hand released it. Harald's preferred solution was brutal. He designated Eric as his chosen heir and encouraged Eric to eliminate the competition. This was not metaphorical. Eric killed at least 2 of his brothers before their father was dead. He may have killed more. The name Bloodaxe was not awarded for battles against foreigners. It was earned within his own family in the succession struggle that was already underway while Harald still lived. Eric was, by every account we have, terrifying. He was physically large, personally violent, and entirely untroubled by the normal constraints that governed even Viking Age political violence. He killed not just rival brothers, but their supporters, their families, sometimes entire households. He raided constantly, both to acquire wealth and to sharpen his reputation for savagery. By the time his father died around 933, Eric had already established himself as the most dangerous man in Norway, which was precisely the point. This was the man Gunnhild married, not a reformer, not a diplomat, not a builder of institutions, a weapon. The saga evidence suggests she was entirely suited to him. What did their partnership look like in practice? The sources are frustratingly vague about the early years of the marriage, but they preserve enough glimpses to suggest a dynamic. Eric handled the physical violence, the raids, the battles, the executions. Gunnhild handled everything else. She was his political intelligence, his strategic advisor, his connection to a network of alliances and informants that extended far beyond his own grasp. When decisions needed to be made about who to kill and when, the sagas suggest the voice in Eric's ear was often hers. Egil's saga, which is, despite its hostility, our best source for Gunnhild's methods, shows her operating through a combination of direct pressure and patient manipulation. When she identified an enemy, she did not simply demand that Eric kill them. She created the conditions under which killing became necessary or inevitable. She maneuvered targets into positions where they appeared to threaten the crown. She spread rumors that preceded the sword. She understood that in a culture that valued reputation above almost everything, the destruction of a man's honor could be as effective as the destruction of his body, and far less costly. The saga's protagonist, the poet Egil Skallagrimsson, spends much of the narrative in conflict with Gunnhild. She wants him dead. He keeps escaping. At one point, she raises a nething pole against him, a curse stake topped with a horse's head designed to turn the land spirits of a region against a specific person. At another, she sends assassins. At another, she simply waits, knowing that Egil will eventually return to Norway and give her another opportunity. What emerges from these encounters is not a portrait of irrational hatred, but of systematic, patient enmity. Gunnhild does not forget. She does not forgive. She does not let passion override strategy. She acts when the moment is right and waits, for years if necessary, when it is not. Egil survives not because Gunnhild is incompetent, but because he is exceptionally lucky and because the narrative requires his survival. Other enemies were not so fortunate. The body count attributed to Gunnhild's influence during Eric's reign is difficult to calculate precisely, but clearly substantial. Multiple sons of Harald Fairhair died under circumstances the sagas linked to her council. Prominent chieftains who opposed Eric's rule were killed or exiled. The Norwegian aristocracy learned to fear her as much as they feared her husband, and perhaps more, because Eric's violence was at least predictable. You knew what would provoke him. Gunnhild's calculations were opaque. They also had children, many children. The sagas name between 8 and 10 offspring of Eric and Gunnhild, depending on the source. The core are consistent: Harald Greycloak, Gamli, Guthorm, Sigurd Sleva, Ragnfrud, Erling, and Gudrod. There may have been daughters whose names were not preserved. These children were raised in a household that was, by any measure, one of the most violent in Scandinavia. And they were raised to inherit that violence, to continue it, to be worthy of it. The project of Gunnhild's motherhood was not emotional, it was dynastic. She was producing heirs for a throne that their father was holding through pure terror in a country that had never been successfully held by any single family for more than one generation. The sons she raised would need to be hard enough to survive what was coming. They would need to be loyal enough to work together rather than turn on each other the way their father had turned on his brothers. They would need to be instruments. The evidence suggests she succeeded. The sons of Eric and Gunnhild, whatever else they were, remained a coherent political unit for decades after their father's death. They fought together. They ruled together. They died, most of them, together. In a culture where fraternal succession wars were the norm, this unity was remarkable. It suggests a mother whose authority over her sons survived their father's death, a family structure held together by something stronger than affection. What held them together was Gunnhild. Eric's reign as sole king of Norway was brief and bloody. He ruled from approximately 933 to 935, roughly 2 years, and spent most of that time killing people. The opposition to his rule was not ideological, it was simply survival. Norwegian chieftains who had accepted Harald Fairhair's overlordship had done so because Harald offered them a choice between submission and destruction. Eric offered only destruction. He could not be bargained with. He could not be appeased. His wife's intelligence network meant that plotting against him was nearly impossible. His own capacity for violence meant that opposition, once identified, was exterminated. It was unsustainable. The breaking point came from an unexpected direction. Håkon, one of Harald Fairhair's youngest sons, had been sent to England as a child, fostered at the court of King Athelstan, raised Christian, educated in the arts of Anglo-Saxon governance. He had been out of Norway for years. He was, in some ways, more English than Norse, and in 935, he returned. The Norwegian chieftains, desperate for any alternative to Eric, rallied to Håkon immediately. This was not because Håkon was beloved, he was barely known, but because he was not Eric. More importantly, he was not Gunnhild. The sagas are clear that opposition to Eric's rule was also opposition to his wife's influence, that the chieftains who fled to Håkon were men who had felt the pressure of her intelligence network, who had lost relatives to her husband's axes, who understood that submitting to Eric meant submitting to both of them. Håkon won, not through a decisive battle, the sources don't record one, but through the simple mathematics of support. When enough chieftains declared for Håkon, Eric's position became untenable. He could not kill them all. He could not be everywhere at once. And so, sometime in 935, Eric Bloodaxe and Gunnhild gathered their children, their retainers, their movable wealth, and left Norway. They did not intend to stay away forever. The next phase of Gunnhild's life requires us to shift our attention from Scandinavia to England, specifically to Northumbria, the Viking-influenced kingdom that dominated northern England in the 10th century. Northumbria was not, properly speaking, English. Its aristocracy was heavily Norse, its culture was hybrid. Its kings had been a mixture of local rulers and imported Scandinavian warlords for generations. When Eric Bloodaxe arrived in the late 930s, looking for a new kingdom to rule, Northumbria was prepared to receive him. A Norwegian king with a claim to foreign territory, a warrior reputation, and a proven capacity for violence was exactly the kind of figure the Northumbrian political class knew how to use. Eric became king of Northumbria. He may have been king twice. The chronology is disputed, and the evidence suggests he was expelled and restored at least once before his final overthrow. But for roughly a decade, from the late 930s to 954, Eric Bloodaxe ruled York. And beside him, managing the politics he was unsuited to manage, stood Gunnhild. What was she doing during these years? The sources are thinner here than they are for Norway. English chroniclers cared less about the internal dynamics of Northumbrian rule, but we can reconstruct the outlines. She was raising her sons, now teenagers and young men, preparing them for the reconquest of Norway that remained the family's ultimate objective. She was building alliances among the Northumbrian aristocracy, identifying which factions could be trusted and which needed to be neutralized. She was managing the relationship with the Anglo-Saxon kingdom to the south, which regarded Northumbria as a problem to be solved and Eric as a temporary nuisance. She was also, according to some traditions, still practicing magic. The association between Gunnhild and cider persists through the Northumbrian period, surfacing in sagas that describe her cursing enemies across the sea, reaching out through the spirit world to touch men who thought they were safe. Whether this reflects actual practice or simply the continuation of propaganda is impossible to determine. What we can say is that her reputation followed her, that men who knew nothing else about Gunnhild knew she was to be feared. The end came in 954 at a place called Stainmore. The Battle of Stainmore was the defining moment of a crisis that had been building for years. Eric's position in Northumbria had always been precarious. He ruled at the sufferance of factions who could withdraw their support whenever it suited them. By 954, it suited them. The English king Edred was pressing from the south, internal enemies were pressing from within, and Eric, who had never been a diplomat, had not managed to build the kind of consensus that might have preserved his rule. The battle itself is poorly documented. We know it happened in the autumn of 954, somewhere in the Pennine Hills. We know Eric was killed. We know that several of his supporters died with him, including at least one prominent earl named Oswulf, who had been one of his key local allies. Beyond that, the sources descend into confusion and legend. One persistent tradition holds that Eric was betrayed, led into an ambush by a man named Maccus, who may have been acting at the instigation of English interests or may have been settling scores of his own. Another tradition simply records that Eric died in battle, the way men like him were supposed to die, with an axe in his hand and enemies at his feet. For Gunnhild, the death of Eric was catastrophic, but not final. She had spent 20 years as his partner. She had built her power through his violence, yes, but she had also built networks of her own, alliances that did not depend entirely on his survival, a family that was still intact and still capable of projecting force. The project had not ended. It had entered a new phase. She gathered her sons, she assessed the situation, she left Northumbria, which was no longer safe for anyone associated with Eric's regime, and returned to Scandinavia. But not to Norway. Not yet. The destination was Orkney. The Orkney Islands, lying off the northern tip of Scotland, were in 954 a semi-independent Norse earldom, The Earls of Orkney owed nominal allegiance to the Norwegian crown, but governed their own affairs in practice, maintaining alliances with the kingdoms of Scotland and Ireland, as well as with Scandinavian powers. For a displaced Norwegian queen with a claim to restore and sons to position, Orkney was ideal. Close enough to Norway to maintain pressure, far enough to be safe from immediate retaliation, connected to the wider web of Norse Atlantic politics. Gunnhild installed herself in Orkney. The sagas suggest she did not ask permission. The Earl of Orkney at this time was Thorfinn Skullsplitter, a name that suggests a man who might have objected to a foreign queen establishing herself on his islands without consultation. But Thorfinn accommodated her. Perhaps he calculated that opposition was more dangerous than acceptance. Perhaps he was playing a longer game, hoping to use her sons as pieces in his own strategies. Perhaps, and this is speculation, but informed speculation, Gunnhild made him an offer he could not refuse. From Orkney, she began the work of preparing the reconquest. Norway, in the mid-950s, was ruled by Håkon the Good, the same Håkon who had displaced Eric 2 decades earlier. Håkon had proven a competent king. He had introduced legal and administrative reforms influenced by his English upbringing. He had managed the aristocracy without resorting to Eric's methods of mass terror. He was, by the standards of 10th century Norse kingship, successful. But he had weaknesses. He was Christian, or at least Christian-leaning, in a country that was still predominantly pagan. He had no legitimate children, and he was opposed by the faction that had always opposed him, the descendants and relatives of Harald Fairhair's other sons, the survivors of the succession wars, the families that had suffered under Eric's rule, but also remembered their own claims to the throne. Gunnhild knew how to use these weaknesses. She had spent 20 years watching Norwegian politics from the inside. She knew who could be bribed, who could be threatened, who could be played against whom. From Orkney, she began sending messages, establishing contacts, building the coalition that would eventually support her son's invasion. The saga account of this period is fragmentary, but it preserves the essential dynamic. Gunnhild as the strategic brain, her sons as the military arm, the whole operation coordinated toward the single objective of recovering the throne that had been taken from them. It would take years. It would require patience of a kind that Eric had never possessed. But Gunnhild had patience. She had always had patience. It was, perhaps, her most dangerous quality. The invasion came in 961. Håkon the Good had ruled for roughly 25 years, an extraordinarily long reign by the standards of the period. He had survived multiple attempts on his life. He had managed the delicate balance between his Christian inclinations and his pagan subjects. He had grown old in a profession where growing old was itself a form of victory. But in 961, the sons of Eric returned. They came with ships. The sagas give numbers, but saga numbers are unreliable. What matters is that they came with enough force to contest the throne, enough men to fight pitched battles, enough momentum to suggest that Håkon's long reign might be ending. Behind them, directing strategy, maintaining alliances, ensuring that supplies and reinforcements flowed where they were needed, was Gunnhild. The decisive engagement was the Battle of Fitjar, fought on an island off the western coast of Norway in the autumn of 961. It was bloody, it was close, and at its end, Håkon the Good was dead, mortally wounded according to the sagas by an arrow fired from the ship of Gunnhild's son, Eystein Erlendsson. Harald Greycloak, the eldest of Gunnhild's surviving sons, became king of Norway. It had taken 26 years. Eric had been dead for 7. The family had been driven from their homeland, scattered to the edges of the Norse world, forced to survive on the sufferance of foreign earls. And now, through a combination of patient diplomacy, strategic violence, and the relentless application of political intelligence, Gunnhild had restored them. The mother of kings had made her sons into kings. But the reign of Harald Greycloak would not be like the reign of his father. It would be different in method, different in character, different in the nature of the power it wielded. Because behind the throne, shaping every decision, stood not a warrior king, but something stranger and more enduring. The woman who had learned to rule in her husband's shadow would now rule through her sons. And Norway, which had thought itself rid of her, would learn what that meant. The first thing it meant was consolidation. Harald Greycloak inherited a kingdom, but he did not inherit stability. The men who had fought for Håkon were still alive. The regional jarls who had accommodated themselves to Håkon's rule had not suddenly become loyal to the sons of Eric Bloodaxe. The web of alliances and rivalries that constituted Norwegian politics in the 10th century did not dissolve because one man died and another took his title. It shifted, it reconfigured, and it waited to see what the new king would do. What the new king did was listen to his mother. The sagas are explicit on this point, and their explicitness is itself significant. Medieval Norse texts rarely foreground women's political agency unless that agency was so visible, so consequential, that it could not be ignored. When the Heimskringla and the various royal sagas describe Gunnhild's role in Harald Greycloak's government, they are not inventing a literary trope. They are recording something that contemporaries noticed and remarked upon, that the real power in Norway during this period resided not in the young king, but in the older woman who stood beside him. She was in her 50s now, perhaps older. The sources do not give us precise ages, but if she had married Eric in the late 920s or early 930s, and if she had been in her teens or early 20s at the time, both reasonable assumptions, then by 981 she would have been a woman entering the final third of a 10th century lifespan. Old enough to have grandchildren, old enough to have buried a husband and at least some of her sons, old enough to have accumulated the kind of experience that cannot be taught, only survived, and old enough to understand that the victory at Fitjar was not an ending, but a beginning. The immediate problem was Jarl Sigurd of Ladi. The Lade Jarls were the most powerful regional dynasty in Norway outside the royal line itself. They controlled the Trøndelag, the rich agricultural and trading region around the Trondheimsfjord. They commanded significant military resources, and they had been among Håkon, the Good's most important supporters. Sigurd had fought alongside Håkon at Fitjar. His son, Håkon Sigurdsson, later to become one of the most significant figures in Norwegian history, was already a young man of notable ambition. A straightforward king might have moved immediately to destroy the Lade Jarls. Eric Bloodaxe would have tried to kill them. It was his preferred solution to most political problems, and it had contributed significantly to the brevity of his reign. But Gunnhild did not advise straightforward action. She advised patience, she advised accommodation, she advised, in effect, that her son should do what his father had never been capable of doing, build a coalition rather than simply terrify one into submission. The early years of Harald Greycloak's reign were accordingly marked by negotiation rather than massacre. Sigurd of Lade was permitted to retain his position. Other jarls who had supported Håkon were treated with relative leniency. The new regime presented itself not as a restoration of Eric's terror, but as something more moderate, more willing to share power, more cognizant of the need to govern with at least the acquiescence of the Norwegian aristocracy. This was Gunnhild's strategy. The sagas attribute it to her directly, and there is no reason to doubt them. She had watched her husband's approach fail. She had spent decades in exile because of that failure. She was not going to repeat it. The goal was not merely to seize power, but to hold it, to create a regime stable enough to survive the inevitable challenges, flexible enough to adapt to changing circumstances, ruthless enough to eliminate genuine threats, but not so ruthless that it created new enemies faster than it could destroy old ones. For a time, it worked. But accommodation had its limits, and Gunnhild knew where those limits lay. She was willing to tolerate rivals. She was willing to share power with regional jarls. She was not willing to leave potential threats unaddressed simply because addressing them might be difficult or might create temporary instability. The patience she had cultivated over decades of exile was not passivity. It was the patience of the hunter waiting for the right moment to strike. The first targets were the remaining sons of Håkon the Good's allies. Not Sigurd of Lade. He was too powerful, too necessary, too deeply embedded in the power structure to be removed without a major war. But there were others. Minor jarls whose loyalty was doubtful, chieftains who had fought at Fitjar on the losing side, men whose continued existence represented a potential rallying point for future opposition. These Gunnhild marked for elimination. The method was characteristic of her approach: indirect, deniable, patient. She did not send armies, she sent sons, Harald Greycloak and his brothers, Erling, Gudrud, Ragnfred, the survivors of the 14 children Eric had allegedly sired, were dispatched on what the sagas describe as royal progresses, tours through the regions of Norway that combined the ceremonial functions of kingship with the practical work of identifying and eliminating threats. The eliminations were not always violent. Sometimes a rival jarl would simply find that his trading partnerships had evaporated, that his allies were no longer returning his messages, that the network of relationships on which his power depended was being systematically dismantled. Sometimes a chieftain would be invited to a feast and would find himself detained afterward, his household goods confiscated, his followers dispersed, his lands reassigned to someone more reliable. The sagas record some outright killings, men ambushed on the road, men killed in their beds, men drowned in circumstances that were officially accidents. But the overall picture is of a regime that preferred to neutralize rather than annihilate, to marginalize rather than martyr. This was sophisticated. It was, by the standards of 10th century governance, almost administrative in its approach, and it reflected Gunnhild's understanding that the real currency of power in Norway was not the number of men you could kill, but the number of relationships you could control. Kill a rival, and you create a martyr, a grievance, a cause around which opposition can coalesce. Marginalize a rival, and you create a warning, a demonstration effect, a lesson to others about the costs of disloyalty. The lesson was learned. Over the first years of Harald Greycloak's reign, the opposition that might have formed around Hakon's memory failed to coalesce. The jarls who might have rebelled calculated the odds and decided that accommodation was safer than resistance. The potential claimants who might have emerged from the woodwork of Harald Fairhair's sprawling lineage stayed quiet, watching, waiting to see whether the new regime would stumble. It did not stumble, not at first. But see, the economic dimension of Gunnhild's strategy is often overlooked, but it was central to the regime's power. Norway in the 10th century was not a wealthy kingdom by European standards. It lacked the agricultural surplus of France or Germany, the urban development of Italy or Byzantium, the concentrated population that could be taxed and administered in more centralized polities. What Norway had was trade in furs and walrus ivory from the Arctic, trade in slaves captured from raids, trade in goods transshipped from the wider Norse world. And what Norway had, above all, was control over the sea routes that connected the North Atlantic to the Baltic, the Arctic to the North Sea, the trading posts of the East to the markets of the West. Gunnhild understood this. She had grown up in a family deeply involved in Arctic trade. She had married a king whose wealth derived largely from his control over trading routes. She had spent years in Orkney and Northumbria observing how wealth flowed through the Norse Atlantic economy. When she advised her sons on governance, she advised them to control the choke points, to tax the trade, to ensure that the wealth that flowed through Norway enriched the crown rather than the regional jarls. The sagas preserve a specific accusation against Harald Greycloak's regime, that it was greedy, that it overtaxed, that it squeezed the farmers and traders of Norway to support a court that consumed more than it produced. Modern historians have sometimes read this as evidence of incompetence, a regime that killed the goose-laying golden eggs. But there is another reading. The concentration of wealth in royal hands may have been deliberate, a strategy to weaken potential rivals by denying them the economic resources they would need to mount a challenge. If the jarls were poor and the king was rich, the jarls could not afford to rebel. If the traders were dependent on royal favor for access to markets, the traders would support royal policies. This was Gunnhild's logic. It was, in its way, a form of state building, the use of economic control to create political dependency, the replacement of personal loyalty with structural necessity. It was also dangerous. Overtax too aggressively, and you create the very desperation that drives people to rebel despite the odds. Concentrate wealth too effectively, and you become a target, not just for internal rivals, but for external powers who see an opportunity to seize what you have accumulated. Harald Bluetooth was watching. The King of Denmark had been watching since long before Harald Greycloak took the throne. Denmark and Norway had a complicated relationship in this period, sometimes allied, sometimes hostile, always competitive. Bluetooth had his own ambitions, his own vision of a Scandinavian order with Denmark at its center. A weak Norway served Danish interests. A strong Norway, unified under a competent regime, was a potential threat, and a Norway ruled by Gunnhild was neither weak nor easily manipulated. Bluetooth had dealt with Eric Bloodaxe. He knew what that family was capable of. He also knew that Gunnhild was more dangerous than Eric had ever been, more patient, more strategic, more capable of playing the long game that 10th century politics required. The opening he was waiting for came from an unexpected direction. Sigurd of Lad was dead by 993, roughly 2 years into Harald Greycloak's reign. The sources are unclear on whether his death was natural or assisted. What is clear is that his son, Hakon Sigurdsson, inherited the jarldom and immediately became the focal point for opposition to the regime. Hakon was young, ambitious, capable. He had his father's resources and his father's resentments, but none of his father's caution. He looked at Gunnhild's regime and saw an opportunity. The details of the next several years are fragmentary. The sagas compress time, skip over developments that must have taken months or years, focus on dramatic incidents while ignoring the slow accumulation of grievances that made those incidents possible. What emerges is a picture of growing tension between the crown and the Lade Jarls, tension that Gunnhild's strategy of accommodation had postponed, but not eliminated. Hakon Sigurdsson began reaching out to other jarls dissatisfied with the regime's taxation policies, to chieftains who had lost relatives to the sons of Eric, to Harald Bluetooth in Denmark, who was only too happy to encourage anything that might destabilize his northern neighbor. The coalition that should have formed in the aftermath of Fitjar, the opposition that Gunnhild's patient diplomacy had prevented from coalescing, was now coalescing anyway, not around the memory of Hakon the Good, but around the living ambition of Hakon Sigurdsson. Gunnhild saw what was happening. The sagas preserve an image of her in this period as increasingly hawkish, increasingly willing to advocate for direct action against the Lade Jarls. The accommodation strategy had bought time, but the time was running out. Her sons needed to act before Hakon Sigurdsson's coalition became strong enough to challenge them openly. The problem was Harald Bluetooth. If the sons of Eric moved against Hakon Sigurdsson, Bluetooth would intervene. He had made that clear. Denmark had the resources to tip the balance in any Norwegian civil war, and Bluetooth intended to use those resources to shape the outcome in Denmark's favor. Gunnhild's regime was caught between an internal rival it could not safely destroy and an external power it could not safely ignore. Her solution was characteristic. She decided to remove Bluetooth from the equation by making him an ally. The marriage proposal was sent sometime in the mid-960s. The exact date is uncertain, the exact terms even more so. What the sources agree on is the basic structure of the offer, a marriage alliance between the Royal House of Norway and the Royal House of Denmark, cementing a partnership that would eliminate the possibility of Danish intervention in Norwegian affairs while simultaneously isolating Hakon Sigurdsson from his most powerful potential supporter. It was a reasonable strategy. Marriage alliances were the standard diplomatic tool of the period. Bluetooth himself had used them repeatedly to secure his position. A Norwegian queen in Denmark, or a Danish princess in Norway, would create the kind of family connection that made war between the two kingdoms less likely and cooperation more natural. What made the proposal unusual was its source. Gunnhild was not merely supporting the alliance. She was, according to some saga accounts, its architect. She was the one who identified the strategic necessity, who crafted the terms, who sent the messages that initiated the negotiation. Her sons were the nominal parties to the arrangement, but she was the intelligence behind it. Bluetooth agreed to meet. The meeting would take place in Denmark, at a location of Bluetooth's choosing. Harald Greycloak would attend personally to negotiate the final terms of the alliance. It would be a summit between equals, a conference to establish a new order in Scandinavian politics. Gunnhild advised her son to go. The sources are explicit on this point. She saw the opportunity, a chance to neutralize the Danish threat, to isolate Hakon Sigurdsson, to secure the regime's position for the foreseeable future. The risks were real, but the potential rewards were substantial enough to justify them. What she did not see, what she perhaps could not have seen, was that Bluetooth had no intention of negotiating in good faith. The meeting was a trap. The location was Hals, a royal estate on the Limfjord in northern Jutland. Harold Greycloak arrived with a retinue appropriate to his status, enough men to demonstrate his power, not so many that he seemed to be coming for war. He came as a king meeting an equal, prepared to discuss terms, ready to make the compromises that would secure a lasting peace between Norway and Denmark. Bluetooth was waiting. So was Håkon Sigurdsson. The saga accounts of what happened next are compressed and dramatic in the way that sagas always are when describing treachery. Harold Greycloak was greeted with what seemed like appropriate ceremony. He was invited to a feast. He was treated with the hospitality due to a royal guest. And then, at a moment the sources describe with the spare efficiency of nightmare, Bluetooth's men turned on him. The fighting was brief. Harold Greycloak had brought a king's retinue, not an army. Bluetooth had prepared for exactly this contingency. The Norwegians were outnumbered, surrounded, cut down in the confusion of what must have seemed, for a few terrible moments, like inexplicable chaos. By the time the survivors understood what was happening, Harold Greycloak was dead. The date was approximately 970. Harold Greycloak had ruled Norway for roughly 9 years. He had died at roughly 30 years of age, young by modern standards, old enough by 10th century standards to have been a king, a husband, a father, a man of consequence. He had died because he trusted an invitation from a king who had never intended to let him leave alive. Bluetooth's motivations were straightforward. A weak Norway served Danish interests. A Norway torn by civil war served Danish interests even better. By killing Harold Greycloak and supporting Håkon Sigurdsson's claim to power, Bluetooth could install a client regime in Oslo, a jarl who owed his position to Danish intervention and would therefore remain dependent on Danish support. It was cynical, it was brutal, and it was entirely characteristic of 10th century Scandinavian politics. But Bluetooth had not finished. Harold Greycloak was dead, but the real threat, the strategic brain, the patient architect, the woman who had spent 30 years building and rebuilding and refusing to accept defeat, was still alive. Gunnhild had not come to Denmark. She had remained in Norway, waiting for her son to return with news of the alliance that would secure their dynasty's future. The news that came instead was catastrophe. The sources are remarkably consistent about what happened next, which suggests that the event was memorable enough to survive the centuries of oral transmission that preceded the saga's composition. Bluetooth sent a message to Gunnhild. The message invited her to Denmark. It offered her safe conduct, royal hospitality, the opportunity to discuss terms for her family's future now that Harold Greycloak was dead. She went. This is the fact that requires explanation. Gunnhild was not naive. She was not trusting. She had spent her entire adult life navigating the treacheries of Norse politics. She had survived a husband whose approach to governance was essentially serial murder. She had survived exile, invasion, the deaths of multiple children, the endless maneuvering of rivals who wanted her family destroyed. She had just lost a son to Bluetooth's treachery. Why would she accept an invitation from the man who had killed him? The saga Heimskringla offers one explanation, that Bluetooth deceived her with false promises, that he sent assurances convincing enough to overcome her suspicions, that he played on her hope that some accommodation might still be possible. Another explanation is simpler and darker. She had no choice. Harold Greycloak was dead. His brothers, and the surviving sons of Eric, were scattered, their power broken, their coalition dissolved. Håkon Sigurdsson was taking control of Norway with Danish backing. Gunnhild had no army, no allies, no realistic prospect of resistance. Her options were to flee into permanent exile, to watch everything she had built collapse into nothing, or to try, one last time, to negotiate her way out of disaster. She chose negotiation. She chose to bet on her ability to manipulate, to persuade, to find some angle that would allow her to survive and perhaps, eventually, to recover. It was the approach she had used her entire life. It had always worked before. It did not work this time. The bog was in Jutland. The sources do not give its exact location, only its nature, a wetland, a marsh, a place where the boundary between land and water was uncertain and treacherous. The Norse had a long relationship with such places. They had been depositing offerings in bogs for centuries, weapons and jewelry, and occasionally human bodies, gifts to gods whose worship required that valuable things be given to the earth and the water. Bluetooth brought Gunnhild to the bog. He brought her there under the guise of the meeting she had been promised, and then, according to the sagas, he had her drowned. The method was deliberate. Drowning in a bog was not a battlefield death, not the kind of ending that granted honor or glory or a place among the worthy dead. It was an execution, a humiliation, a demonstration that Gunnhild, who had wielded power over kings and kingdoms for 4 decades, was now utterly powerless, reduced to a body in the water, a corpse in the mud, a warning to anyone who might challenge Danish supremacy. The date was approximately 970, or shortly thereafter. Gunnhild Gorm's daughter, or whatever her birth name had been before the sagas assigned her the patronymic that tied her to Danish royalty, was dead. She had been born in the early decades of the 10th century, in the Arctic or in Denmark, to shamans or to kings. She had married a king and helped him rule. She had survived his death and raised their sons in exile. She had engineered a restoration and guided a regime. She had outlasted rivals and outmaneuvered enemies and refused, decade after decade, to accept the defeats that should have ended her career. She was in her 60s when she died, perhaps older. She had been a power in Norse politics for roughly 40 years. She had been called a sorceress by men who could not otherwise explain how a woman had achieved what she achieved. She had been called a kingmaker by historians who could not deny the evidence of what she had built. And now she was dead in a Danish bog, and the dynasty she had spent her life constructing was finished. Håkon Sigurdsson would rule Norway as a jarl under Danish oversight. The sons of Eric who survived would scatter into obscurity. The line of Harald Fairhair would continue through other branches. But Gunnhild's branch, the branch she had fought so hard to preserve, would fade from the center of Norwegian politics. The water of the bog would have been cold. The mud would have filled her lungs. The last thing she saw might have been the sky above Jutland, gray and indifferent, the same sky that had watched her entire life unfold and would watch the centuries after her death with equal indifference. The sagas do not record her final words. They do not tell us whether she struggled or surrendered, whether she cursed Bluetooth or remained silent, whether she died believing that some future would vindicate her or knowing that everything she had built was ending in the muck of a foreign marsh. They tell us only that she died, and that the water took her, and that the age she had helped to shape continued without her, carrying the consequences of her choices into futures she would never see. The consequences were already in motion before her body settled into the peat. In Norway, the news traveled the way all news traveled in the 10th century, by ship, by rumor, by the slow accumulation of reports from traders and travelers who had heard something from someone who had been in Denmark when it happened. Håkon Sigurdsson would have learned of Gunnhild's death within weeks, perhaps within days if the winds favored the messengers. He would have understood immediately what it meant. The woman who had been his adversary for more than a decade, the architect of his exile, the power behind the sons who had driven him from his lands. She was gone. And with her went the last coherent organizing force of the Eiríksson faction. The sons who remained were scattered and leaderless. Ragnfred, if he still lived, was in Orkney, clinging to whatever authority the earls there permitted him. Others had died in the long struggle for Norway, cut down in battles that the sagas record with varying degrees of detail. Still others had simply disappeared from the historical record, their fates unknown, their lines extinct or absorbed into other families whose names the sources preserved. Without Gunnhild to coordinate their efforts, to identify opportunities, to remind them of what they were owed and what they might yet reclaim, the surviving sons were simply men with impressive lineages and no kingdoms to rule. Håkon understood this. Harald Bluetooth understood it too, which was almost certainly why he had acted when he did. By eliminating Gunnhild, Bluetooth had not merely removed an irritant or avenged some real or imagined slight. He had restructured the political landscape of the North Sea world. The Eriksson claim to Norway was not legally extinguished. Bloodlines do not work that way, but it was practically neutralized. There was no longer anyone with the vision, the connections, and the ruthlessness to prosecute that claim. There was no longer anyone who could transform a lineage into a faction, a grievance into a campaign, a memory of past glory into a present threat. The bog had done what armies could not. We should pause here to consider what we actually know about this death, because the sources are characteristically difficult. The drowning in the bog appears in the saga tradition, but the tradition is not uniform in its details. Some versions emphasize Bluetooth's personal involvement. Others suggest that he merely ordered the execution and left the mechanics to subordinates. Some versions place the event in the context of a broader Danish political consolidation, a cleanup operation in which Gunnhild was simply one of several inconvenient figures who needed to be removed. Others treat it as a singular act of treachery, a violation of the guest right that the Norse held sacred, a crime that would have consequences for Bluetooth's own reputation and perhaps for his soul. The archaeological record offers no confirmation. No body has been recovered that can be definitively identified as Gunnhild's. The bogs of Jutland have yielded many preserved corpses over the centuries. The famous bog bodies that tourists visit in Danish museums, their skin tanned to leather by the acidic water, their faces frozen in expressions that seem to speak across millennia, but none of them can be linked to this particular death of this particular woman. The peat that preserved so many anonymous victims did not preserve her, or if it did, it preserved her so well that she has not yet been found, waiting somewhere beneath the surface of a Danish wetland for the spade that will one day disturb her rest. What we have, then, is a story told by Icelanders writing centuries after the events, working from oral traditions that had been shaped and reshaped by generations of telling, influenced by literary conventions and political agendas, and the simple human tendency to make narratives more dramatic than the facts might warrant. The story tells us that Gunnhild died in a bog, and that Bluetooth killed her, and that the method was drowning. The story does not tell us whether these things are true, but the story is what survives. And the story, whatever its relationship to historical fact, tells us something important about how later generations understood Gunnhild and her end. They understood it as dark. They understood it as fitting, in the grim Norse sense of fitting, the sorceress who had manipulated so many endings, finally meeting an ending she could not manipulate. They understood it as the closure of something, the end of an era, the final settling of accounts that had been accumulating for decades. The bog was not just a location. It was a symbol, and the symbol spoke to audiences who heard the story for centuries after Gunnhild's body had returned to the earth, from which, the sagas suggested, her power had always derived. The years after 970 belonged to other people. Håkon Sigurdsson consolidated his control over Norway with Danish backing, ruling as a jarl rather than a king, a technical distinction that acknowledged Bluetooth's nominal overlordship while leaving Håkon with effective autonomy in his own territories. He was a capable administrator and a skilled military commander, and he brought a period of relative stability to a country that had known little stability since Harald Fairhair's death decades earlier. He also maintained the traditional Norse religion against the Christianity that Bluetooth was promoting throughout Denmark, a choice that would eventually contribute to his own downfall, but that in the 970s and 980s made him popular with many Norwegians who resented the new faith and the foreign influence it represented. Håkon ruled for nearly 3 decades. He outlasted Bluetooth, who died in 986 or 987, probably murdered by his own son, Sweyn Forkbeard, in circumstances that the sources describe with the same mixture of detail and uncertainty that characterizes all 10th century political history. He outlasted the generation of rivals who had contested power with him in his youth. He did not, in the end, outlast his own appetites. He was killed in 995 by a slave who had been commanded to murder him by a woman whose husband Håkon had wronged. The symmetry was almost too perfect, the man who had benefited from Gunnhild's death dying at the hands of another woman's vengeance, another woman's manipulation of the men around her. The sagas appreciated this kind of echo. They may have exaggerated it, but the basic fact of Håkon's death, killed by servants in a pigsty while hiding from the forces of a new rival, is probably accurate. The rival was Olaf Tryggvason, a great-grandson of Harald Fairhair, through a different line than Gunnhild's sons. Olaf had spent much of his life in exile, including significant time in England and in the Slavic lands to the east. He had converted to Christianity and returned to Norway with the intention of claiming the throne and converting the country. He succeeded in the first goal and partially succeeded in the second, ruling for 5 years before dying in a naval battle against a coalition of his enemies, including the Danes and the Swedes and the sons of Hakon Sigurdsson, who were eager to avenge their father and reclaim their patrimony. The pattern should be familiar by now. Every generation produced new claimants, new alliances, new betrayals. Every settlement was temporary. Every victory created the conditions for the next conflict. Norway, in the late 10th and early 11th centuries, was a country that had not yet learned to be a country, a collection of regions and factions and personal loyalties that defied permanent consolidation, that resisted every attempt to impose the kind of stable hierarchical order that was emerging elsewhere in Europe. Gunnhild had understood this. She had operated within this reality for 40 years, never expecting permanent victory, always preparing for the next reversal, always identifying the next alliance that might preserve her position or advance her son's claims. Her genius, if it can be called that, was adaptive rather than transformative. She did not try to change the rules of the game. She tried to play the game better than anyone else, for longer than anyone else, with more resilience and fewer illusions than anyone else. She failed in the end. But the end was a long time coming, and the world she left behind was in many ways the world she had helped to create, chaotic, competitive, violent, but also dynamic, resistant to tyranny, suspicious of permanent authority. The jarls and kings who followed her operated in a landscape she had helped to shape, even if they did not know it, even if her name faded from political relevance within a generation of her death. There is a question that historians have debated, though not always explicitly, and it concerns the nature of Gunnhild's power. The sagas call her a sorceress. They attribute to her the ability to summon storms, to curse enemies, to divine the future, to manipulate the minds and bodies of men through means that ordinary women did not possess. Modern readers tend to dismiss these claims as medieval fantasy, as the projection onto a powerful woman of supernatural abilities that explained her influence, without requiring men to acknowledge that a woman might simply have been more intelligent, more determined, or more politically skilled than they were. This dismissal is probably correct as far as it goes. There is no reason to believe that Gunnhild could actually control the weather or cast spells that caused her enemies to sicken and die. But the dismissal may be too easy. It may miss something important about how power worked in the 10th century North and about how Gunnhild specifically wielded the power she possessed. The Norse world was a world in which the supernatural was real. Not metaphorically real, not symbolically real, but actually practically, operationally real. The men and women who lived in that world believed that certain people could communicate with spirits, could see the future, could influence events through rituals and incantations. They believed this because their culture told them it was true, and because they had no framework for understanding certain phenomena, illness, luck, coincidence, the mysterious success of certain individuals, except through supernatural explanation. To say that Gunnhild was a sorceress was not merely to insult her or to exaggerate her abilities. It was to describe a type of person that the culture recognized as genuinely existing. And here is the crucial point. It does not matter whether Gunnhild actually possessed supernatural powers. What matters is whether her contemporaries believed she did. If they believed it, then she had power. If men feared her curses, if they altered their behavior to avoid her displeasure, if they sought her favor because they thought she could influence outcomes through means beyond ordinary politics, then the belief itself was a form of power, regardless of whether the supernatural abilities were real. This is what the sagas may be telling us beneath their surface narrative of spells and sorcery. They may be telling us that Gunnhild cultivated a reputation for supernatural ability, that she encouraged others to believe she was more than an ordinary woman, that she understood how fear and awe could substitute for the military force and institutional authority that she, as a woman in a patriarchal society, could not directly command. The Arctic apprenticeship that the sagas describe, the years spent learning from Sami shamans in the far north, may be legendary. But the legend may encode a truth about the persona Gunnhild projected, the role she played, the carefully constructed image of uncanny knowledge that she used to amplify her influence beyond what mere political skill could achieve. Consider the practical implications. A woman who was believed to be a sorceress could not be safely ignored. She could not be safely betrayed. She could not be safely insulted or marginalized or set aside. Every man who dealt with her would carry in the back of his mind the possibility that crossing her might bring consequences beyond the ordinary political kind: illness, bad luck, the mysterious failure of his ships or his crops or his health. This belief created a zone of caution around her, a buffer of fear that protected her from the casual violence and casual disregard that more ordinary women might have faced. The tragedy, if it is a tragedy, is that the protection was not absolute. Bluetooth, in the end, was not deterred. He brought her to the bog and he drowned her, and whatever curses she may have uttered as the water filled her lungs, whatever spells she may have attempted as her consciousness faded, they did not save her. The supernatural reputation that had served her for so long could not protect her from a king who had decided she needed to die and who had the men and the opportunity to make it happen. Perhaps Bluetooth did not believe in her powers. Perhaps he was a skeptic, a pragmatist, a man who calculated political advantages and ignored supernatural risks. Or perhaps he believed but acted anyway, accepting whatever curse she might place on him as the price of eliminating a threat to his interests. The sources do not tell us what was in his mind. They tell us only what he did. The body in the bog. We keep returning to it because the image is so powerful, so final, so unlike the death that a woman of Gunnhild's stature might have expected. Queens died in their beds, surrounded by family, blessed by priests, mourned by subjects. They did not die face down in marsh water, their lungs filling with mud, their bodies consigned to a place that was neither land nor sea, neither grave nor memorial. The Norse understood bogs as liminal spaces. The scholarship on bog bodies, the preserved corpses found in wetlands across northern Europe, suggests that many of them were ritual sacrifices, offerings to gods of fertility or war or the underworld. Others may have been criminals or outcasts, people expelled from the community of the living and consigned to a place that was itself outside the normal categories of the world. The bog was where you put things that did not belong elsewhere. The bog was where boundaries dissolved. For Gunnhild to die in a bog was for her to be placed outside history, outside memory, outside the commemorative practices that preserved the names and deeds of important people. Bluetooth was not merely killing her, he was erasing her. He was denying her the honored death that would have given her a place among the ancestors, a seat in the hall of the worthy, a name that descendants would invoke with pride. He was turning her into a bog body, anonymous and discarded, indistinguishable from the other corpses that the wetlands had swallowed over the centuries. The sagas defeated his intention. By recording her death, by naming her, by making her the subject of stories that would be told and retold for generations, the saga authors pulled Gunnhild back from the oblivion that Bluetooth had intended for her. They could not give her back her life. They could not undo what had been done in that Danish marsh. But they could ensure that she was remembered, that her name survived, that the water did not keep her entirely. It is worth considering whether this was their purpose. The saga authors who wrote about Gunnhild were not, for the most part, sympathetic to her. They portrayed her as manipulative, as ruthless, as unnaturally powerful in ways that disturbed the proper order of things. They made her a villain in many of the stories they told, an antagonist to the heroes whose deeds they wished to celebrate, and yet they remembered her. They gave her speeches and schemes and complexity. They made her interesting, even when they made her terrible. Perhaps they understood that villainy, too, is a form of significance. Perhaps they recognized that a woman who had played the game as long and as hard as Gunnhild had played it deserved to be remembered, even if the memory was not flattering. Perhaps they were simply telling the stories they had inherited, repeating what they had heard from their fathers and grandfathers, preserving a tradition that had decided long ago that Gunnhild was worth talking about. Whatever their motives, the result is that we know her name. 1,000 years after her death, we are speaking of her, puzzling over her, trying to understand who she was and what she did and why it mattered. Bluetooth wanted her forgotten. The bog wanted her dissolved. The centuries wanted her irrelevant, one more corpse in the long procession of corpses that history leaves behind. She refused. There's one more thing to say about the death, and it concerns the manner in which the sagas describe it. The drowning is presented as an act of treachery, a violation of the trust that Gunnhild placed in Bluetooth when she accepted his invitation and traveled to Denmark. The sagas make clear that she came expecting negotiation, expecting the meeting of equals that her status demanded, expecting the basic protections that custom afforded to anyone who traveled under a king's safe conduct. What she received instead was an ambush, a betrayal, an ending that came not through fair combat or even open hostility, but through deception. The saga authors disapproved of this. Their disapproval is evident in the way they tell the story, in the details they choose to emphasize, in the moral weight they place on Bluetooth's treachery. The Norse valued honesty, at least in certain contexts. They valued the keeping of oaths, the honoring of agreements, the maintenance of one's word as a bond that could be trusted. A man who violated these principles was Nidingur, a term that combined meanings of cowardice, treachery, and moral corruption. The sagas come close to calling Bluetooth a Nidingur for what he did to Gunnhild, though they stop short of using the word explicitly. This is remarkable, given how unsympathetically the same sagas often portray Gunnhild herself. She is shown manipulating, scheming, ordering executions, encouraging her sons toward violence and vengeance. She is not a sympathetic figure in most of the stories told about her, and yet her death is treated as wrong, as a violation of norms that even enemies should observe, as an act that diminished Bluetooth more than it diminished her. The implication is that there were rules to the game, even when the players were ruthless. There were limits, even when the stakes were existential. You could kill your enemies, but you were supposed to kill them fairly, openly, in ways that allowed them the dignity of resistance. You were not supposed to lure them into traps with false promises of negotiation. You were not supposed to drown them in bogs like criminals or sacrifices or unwanted children. Bluetooth broke the rules, and the sagas remembered. The memory of treachery has a particular weight in the historical record. It sticks. It adheres to names and reputations in ways that straightforward violence, however brutal, does not. A king could burn a hall with his enemies inside and be remembered as decisive. A warrior could kill a dozen men in battle and be celebrated for his prowess. But a man who broke his word, who violated the sacred contract of hospitality, who used an invitation as bait for a trap, that man carried a stain that no subsequent achievement could entirely wash away. Harald Bluetooth built churches. He unified Denmark. He brought Christianity to his people and inscribed his accomplishments on a runestone that still stands. And yet in the saga tradition, one of the things he is remembered for is drowning an old woman in a bog after promising her safe passage. This is what Gunnhild's death cost him. Not his kingdom, not his power, not his influence over the political landscape of Scandinavia. Those things remained intact. But his reputation, the way future generations would speak of him, the moral texture of his legacy, these were marked by what he did to her. The saga authors who disapproved of the drowning were not Gunnhild's partisans. They were not defending her because they admired her or because they thought she had been wrongly treated throughout her life. They were defending a principle, a boundary, a line that distinguished legitimate political violence from something darker and more corrosive. Bluetooth had crossed that line, and crossing it meant that even his victories would carry an asterisk, a whispered qualification, a memory of the bog that would never entirely dissipate. We should pause here to consider what this tells us about the world Gunnhild inhabited. It was a world of extraordinary violence, a world where men and women died young and often, where political disputes were resolved through force and vendetta and blood feud, where the concept of peaceful transfer of power was essentially unknown. And yet it was not a world without rules. It was not a world where anything was permitted simply because you had the strength to do it. There were norms, customs, expectations, a grammar of violence, if you will, that distinguished acceptable killing from unacceptable killing, honorable warfare from dishonorable treachery, legitimate power from mere brutality. Gunnhild understood this grammar perfectly. She had spent her entire adult life speaking it, using it, manipulating it for her own purposes. When she encouraged her sons to pursue vendettas, she was operating within the accepted framework of Norse justice, where a killing demanded compensation, or counter-killing, where failure to avenge was itself a form of dishonor. When she orchestrated the deaths of rivals and enemies, she did so through methods that the culture recognized as legitimate, through open accusations, through challenges, through the deployment of forces that fought in daylight. She was ruthless, but she was ruthless in ways that the society she lived in could accommodate and even respect. Bluetooth's killing of her broke that accommodation. It was not a killing that followed the grammar. It was a killing that used the grammar's conventions, the invitation, the promise of negotiation, the implicit guarantee of safe passage, as weapons in themselves. He did not defeat her. He tricked her. And in tricking her, he demonstrated something about himself that the saga authors found more troubling than any of Gunnhild's schemes. There is an irony here that deserves attention. Bluetooth was, by most measures, a more successful ruler than any of Gunnhild's sons. He held Denmark together. He expanded its influence. He navigated the transition to Christianity with a skill that few of his contemporaries could match. He was, in modern terms, a competent administrator, a shrewd diplomat, a king who understood that power required more than just the ability to win battles. And yet the sagas remember him killing an old woman through treachery, and they remember it with disapproval. His competence did not excuse the manner of the killing. His achievements did not erase the stain. This is the paradox of the historical record. It preserves what it chooses to preserve, and its choices are not always predictable. A man can do great things and be remembered for a small cruelty. A woman can do terrible things and be remembered for the manner of her death rather than the manner of her life. The past does not organize itself according to our preferences. It keeps its own accounts, marks its own debits and credits, arrives at its own judgments that subsequent generations can only inherit and interpret. Gunnhild's death in the bog was one such judgment. The sagas rendered their verdict, that Bluetooth had done something wrong, something that violated the norms of his own society, something that diminished him even as it eliminated a rival. And that verdict stuck. It became part of his story in a way that he could not control, that no amount of church building or runestone carving could alter. He had wanted her forgotten. Instead, he made her death memorable. We must now turn backward in time, though not to relitigate what has already been said. We must return to Norway, to the years before the final exile, to the question of what Gunnhild actually did during the decades when she held power. The sagas give us glimpses, fragments, accusations. They show us a woman involved in the affairs of the kingdom at every level, from the highest politics to the smallest local disputes. They show us a woman whose influence was felt far beyond the royal court, whose name was invoked in places she had never visited, whose reputation preceded her wherever her son's authority reached. But what did this influence look like in practice? What did it mean to be Gunnhild, sitting at the center of a web of power that stretched across fjords and mountains and islands? The sagas suggest several answers, none of them complete, all of them revealing. The first and most obvious was her role as counselor. Eric Bloodaxe, whatever his qualities as a warrior, was not known for his political subtlety. The sagas portray him as a man of action, quick to anger, quicker to strike, a king whose preferred solution to most problems involved violence. This was not necessarily a flaw in a Viking ruler. Violence was, after all, the currency of the age, and a king who could not or would not fight was unlikely to hold his throne for long. But violence alone was not sufficient. A king also needed to know when not to fight, which alliances to cultivate, which rivals to appease, which moments called for patience rather than force. Gunnhild provided this knowledge. The sagas show her advising Eric, warning him of dangers he had not perceived, suggesting strategies he had not considered, pulling him back from rash actions that would have cost him support. She was his intelligence network, his early warning system, his interpreter of the political landscape. She saw patterns he missed. She understood motives he could not fathom. She knew which men could be trusted and which could not, which promises meant something and which were merely words. This was not a passive role. It required constant attention, constant gathering of information, constant assessment of threats and opportunities. A counselor who gave bad advice would quickly lose influence, and in the violent world of 10th century Norway, losing influence could easily mean losing one's life. Gunnhild's survival over decades, through Eric's reign, through exile, through the reigns of her sons, through another exile, testifies to the quality of her counsel. She was right more often than she was wrong. She saw clearly when others saw through fog. She earned her position through competence, whatever else she may have earned it through. The second form of influence was more direct. Gunnhild as executor. The sagas show her ordering deaths, commanding actions, directing the machinery of royal power as if it were her own. In some stories, she does not merely advise, she decides. Eric may sit on the throne, but Gunnhild determines who lives and who dies, who receives favor and who receives punishment, who rises and who falls. This is where the historical sources become most problematic. The saga authors were writing centuries after the events they described, relying on oral traditions that had been shaped and reshaped by generations of telling. They were also writing in a context where powerful women were viewed with suspicion, where female agency was often coded as manipulation, where the idea of a woman wielding genuine political power was uncomfortable enough that it had to be explained through accusations of sorcery or seduction. When they show Gunnhild ordering executions, are they reporting what actually happened? Or are they projecting their own anxieties onto a figure who had become, over the centuries, a convenient repository for everything that troubled them about female power? We cannot know for certain. The sources do not permit certainty. But we can observe that the pattern is consistent across multiple sagas, written by different authors at different times for different purposes. They all agree that Gunnhild was powerful. They all agree that her power was real, not merely ceremonial or advisory. They all agree that men feared her, obeyed her, died at her command. This consistency suggests that the tradition, whatever its distortions, preserved a genuine memory. Gunnhild was not merely Eric's wife. She was a force in her own right, and the people who remembered her knew it. The third form of influence was the most mysterious and the most difficult for modern readers to assess. Gunnhild as sorceress. The sagas are explicit about this. They claim she practiced cedar, the form of Norse magic associated with prophecy, manipulation of fate, and the influencing of minds. They claim she learned it in Finnmark, among the Sami people who were believed to possess supernatural powers. They claim she used it throughout her life, bending events to her will through means that went beyond ordinary human capability. What do we do with this? We cannot accept it literally. Magic is not real in the sense the sagas mean it. Gunnhild did not actually curse her enemies into oblivion or prophesy the future with supernatural accuracy. But we cannot simply dismiss it either, because the accusation itself tells us something important about how she was perceived. Cider was, in Norse culture, a deeply ambiguous practice. It was powerful but dangerous, effective but shameful, particularly shameful for men who practiced it. A woman who practiced satyr was operating in a space that the culture had carved out for female power. But it was a suspect space, a space that bordered on the transgressive, a space that invited accusations of unnaturalness and manipulation. When the sagas call Gunnhild a sorceress, they are not simply making a factual claim about her abilities. They are making a cultural claim about the kind of woman she was, the kind of power she wielded, the kind of threat she represented. She was a woman who got what she wanted. She was a woman who influenced powerful men. She was a woman whose enemies had a habit of dying at convenient times. The culture needed a way to explain this, a framework that made sense of a woman who was so thoroughly effective in a world that expected women to be ineffective. Sorcery provided that framework. It allowed the saga authors to acknowledge Gunnhild's power while simultaneously coding it as illegitimate, as outside the normal bounds of acceptable female behavior, as something that required explanation beyond mere competence or intelligence. This is not unique to the Norse. Cultures throughout history have used accusations of witchcraft and sorcery to explain away women whose power they could not otherwise account for. The powerful woman becomes the witch, the seductress, the manipulator, the figure who achieves through dark arts what she should not be able to achieve through ordinary means. The accusation is a kind of backhanded compliment. It acknowledges the power while denying its legitimacy. Gunnhild received this backhanded compliment in full measure. The sagas made her a sorceress because they could not otherwise explain her. They gave her supernatural powers because her natural powers were too disturbing to accept at face value. A woman who had played the political game at the highest levels for half a century, who had survived exile in return, who had seen her husband killed and her sons installed as kings, who had outlasted nearly everyone who had opposed her, this woman required explanation. And the explanation the culture provided was magic. We should not accept the explanation, but we should remember that it was offered, and that it was offered because Gunnhild was, in fact, extraordinary. The sorcery is false. The extraordinariness is real. The years between Eric's death at Stainmore and Gunnhild's own death in the bog span roughly a quarter century. These were the years of her sons, the years when Harald Greycloak and his brothers ruled Norway under their mother's guidance. We have touched on these years already, but they deserve more attention because they represent the fullest expression of Gunnhild's power, and also its limits. Harald Greycloak became king of Norway around 961 after the death of Håkon the Good at the Battle of Fitjar. He was not the only claimant. The political landscape of Norway in this period was contested territory, fought over by rival factions whose conflicts had roots going back generations. But Harald prevailed, at least initially, and his prevailing owed much to the network of support that Gunnhild had cultivated during the years of exile, the alliances she had maintained, the loyalties she had called in when the moment came. For the next decade and a half, Harald ruled. Or rather, Harald and Gunnhild ruled, because the sagas are clear that her influence did not diminish when her son took the throne. If anything, it intensified. She was no longer the wife of the king, but the mother of the king, a position that carried its own authority, its own dignity, its own expectations. She was the queen mother, the power behind the throne, the figure whose approval was necessary for any major decision and whose disapproval could be fatal. The sagas show her active in this role. She encouraged her sons to pursue their enemies, to punish disloyalty, to consolidate their power through whatever means necessary. She advised on matters of war and peace, on marriages and alliances, on the thousand small decisions that determined whether a reign would succeed or fail. She was, in modern terms, the chief strategist, the one who saw the board clearly when others saw only the pieces in front of them. But she was also, according to the sagas, a cause of Harald's eventual failure. Her ruthlessness made enemies. Her willingness to order deaths and confiscations turned potential allies into implacable foes. Her very competence at the game provoked a reaction that she could not control, a coalition of the aggrieved and the ambitious who eventually brought Harald down. This is the tragedy of Gunnhild's life, if tragedy is the right word for it. She was good at power. She understood it, wielded it, maintained it against enormous odds for an enormous span of time. But she was not good enough to overcome the accumulated weight of resentment that her success had generated. Every death she ordered, every rival she eliminated, every piece of property she confiscated, these created debts that would eventually come due. The bills accumulated. The ledger grew. And when the moment of crisis came, there were not enough allies left to pay them off. Harald Greycloak died around 976, killed in a battle that was itself the result of treachery. He had been lured to Denmark by Håkon Sigurdsson, the man who would replace him as the dominant power in Norway, and by Harald Bluetooth, who had his own reasons for wanting the sons of Eric Bloodaxe removed from the scene. The trap was sprung, the battle was lost, and Harald fell. Gunnhild survived, She always survived, but her power was finally irrevocably broken. Her sons were dead or scattered. Her allies were gone, or had switched sides. Her enemies controlled Norway and had no intention of allowing her to return. She was an old woman now, 60 or more in an age when 60 was ancient, with nothing left but her reputation and her claims and the memories of everything she had been. She went to Orkney, she went to Denmark. She went wherever might offer sanctuary, wherever old connections might still hold, wherever there was still someone who remembered what she had been and might be willing to help for the sake of that memory. And eventually, she went to Harald Bluetooth, the man who had helped destroy her son, the man who had every reason to want her eliminated, the man who would finally succeed where so many others had failed. We have already described what happened next, the invitation, the treachery, the bog, the ending that the sagas recorded with such pointed disapproval, the death that should have been the final word. But it was not the final word. The final word belonged to the memory, to the tradition, to the centuries of telling and retelling that kept Gunnhild's name alive long after her body had dissolved into the Danish peat. She was not forgotten. She could not be forgotten. She had made herself too large, too significant, too impossible to ignore. The saga authors who wrote about her centuries later were still wrestling with her. They were still trying to understand what she had been, what her power had meant, how to fit her into their categories of heroism and villainy. They gave her speeches and schemes. They made her terrible and interesting. They preserved her in the amber of their literature, a figure from the distant past who somehow refused to become irrelevant. This is the final paradox of Gunnhild's story. She lost. She lost repeatedly, comprehensively, ultimately. She lost her husband, her kingdom, her sons, her power, her life. She died in a bog, unmourned by those who killed her, forgotten by those who had once feared her. By any ordinary measure, she was a failure, a woman who played the game of thrones and lost. And yet she is still here, still being spoken of, still being puzzled over. The winners of her age, the men who killed her, who outlasted her, who took her kingdom and gave it to their heirs. Where are they? Harald Bluetooth is remembered, yes, but largely as a name, a figure of ecclesiastical history, the man who brought Christianity to Denmark. Hakon Sigurdsson is a footnote. The jarls and petty kings who opposed Gunnhild have mostly vanished into the silence from which no historian can retrieve them. But Gunnhild remains. She remains because she was extraordinary, because she defied the expectations of her age, because she wielded power in ways that demanded attention and explanation. She remains because the saga authors, for all their disapproval, could not bring themselves to leave her out. She remains because a story about a woman who fought as hard as she fought, who survived as long as she survived, who mattered as much as she mattered, that story is worth telling. It has always been worth telling. It will continue to be worth telling for as long as there are people interested in the past and its inhabitants. The bog wanted her dissolved. The centuries wanted her irrelevant. She refused. And now we must return to the question we have been circling throughout this narrative, the question the saga authors themselves could not answer, the question that has haunted every attempt to understand Gunnhild Konungamodir. What was she, really? What did her power consist of? How did a woman in 10th century Scandinavia, a world designed in almost every particular to exclude women from political agency, manage to become not merely influential, but defining? How did she shape the fates of kingdoms for nearly 4 decades? How did she become the thing that kings and jarls whispered about, the shadow behind Eric Bloodaxe's throne, the hand that guided princes and eliminated rivals, the presence that seemed to persist long after the material conditions for her survival had collapsed? The easy answer is sorcery. The sagas say it plainly. They call her a seidkona, a practitioner of the Old Norse magical arts, a woman who had learned the secret knowledge of manipulation and prophecy, who could see what others could not see and do what others could not do. They place her in Finnmark learning these arts from Sami shamans. They have her casting spells, sending spirits, manipulating weather, bending the wills of men to her purposes. They make her not merely cunning, but uncanny, a figure operating outside the normal boundaries of human capability. We cannot know if she believed this about herself. We cannot know if her contemporaries truly believed it about her. What we can say with some confidence is that the accusation of sorcery was a way of making sense of something that otherwise resisted explanation. How did she survive the fall of Eric? Sorcery. How did her sons keep returning to power despite repeated defeats? Sorcery. How did rivals die at convenient moments? How did alliances form when they should have crumbled? How did an exiled widow maintain her relevance across decades of political upheaval? The answer the sagas provide is always the same: magic, the dark arts, powers that ordinary people did not possess and could not counter. But there is another way to read this. Sorcery, in the context of the sagas, is often a label applied to competence that cannot otherwise be explained. A woman who understands politics, who reads people accurately, who anticipates events, who builds networks and maintains them, who knows when to act and when to wait. Such a woman, in a culture that did not expect women to possess these capabilities, might easily be described as working magic. Her knowledge would seem supernatural because the alternative, that she was simply more intelligent, more ruthless, more politically adept than the men around her, was ideologically unacceptable. The society could admit that women might wield dark powers borrowed from spirits and learned from shamans. It could not admit that women might simply be better at the game. This is not to say that Gunnhild was secretly modern, a feminist before her time, a rational actor surrounded by superstitious fools. She lived within her culture's framework of meaning. She may well have practiced satyr, may well have believed in its efficacy, may well have cultivated her reputation for magical knowledge as deliberately as she cultivated her political alliances. The distinction between actual magic and political skill disguised as magic would not have made sense to her or her contemporaries. Power was power. Influence was influence. If people believed you could send spirits to torment your enemies, that belief itself became a form of power, regardless of whether the spirits were real. What matters is that she understood this. She understood that reputation was a weapon, that fear was a resource, that being seen as dangerous was itself a form of protection. She cultivated the persona of the Witch Queen not as a disguise but as an amplification, a way of extending her reach beyond what her physical position would normally allow. When men hesitated to move against her, when rivals died and people whispered about curses, when her sons found support that their own capabilities might not have warranted, the sorcery narrative served her purposes. It made her larger than life. It made her consequences seem inevitable. It made opposing her feel like opposing fate itself. The saga authors, writing centuries later, were working with the materials their tradition had preserved. They had stories about Gunnhild's magic, about her cruelty, about her political machinations. They wove these into narratives that reflected their own literary and moral purposes. But underneath the literary elaboration, underneath the supernatural flourishes and the villain's speeches, there remains the outline of something real. A woman who held power. A woman who kept holding power. A woman who refused to accept the limitations her society prescribed. Consider what she actually accomplished, stripped of the supernatural overlay. She married a king and bore him sons. This was expected. This was her function. But she did not stop there. She made herself indispensable to her husband's rule, involved herself in his decisions, became known as his partner in governance rather than merely his vessel for heirs. When he fell, when his kingdom collapsed, when any ordinary queen widow would have retired to obscurity or remarried into someone else's household, she refused. She kept her sons together. She kept their claim alive. She found resources. She found allies. She mounted not one, but multiple attempts to restore their position in Norway, and one of those attempts actually succeeded. Her son Harald Greycloak ruled Norway for more than a decade, and she ruled alongside him, through him, as the power behind his increasingly unpopular throne. When that too collapsed, when Harald died at Hals and the remaining sons scattered, she still did not accept defeat. She went to Orkney, where another of her sons held power as Jarl. She went to Denmark, seeking new combinations, new possibilities. She was old by then, ancient by the standards of her time, but she was still trying, still scheming, still refusing to become irrelevant. It was this refusal that killed her. Harold Bluetooth was not a man known for political elegance. He was a builder, an organizer, a man who consolidated Danish power and brought Christian missionaries into his realm. But he was also a pragmatist who understood that loose ends could unravel careful work. Gunnhild was a loose end. Her claims to Norway, her connections to exiled princes, her reputation for manipulation and magic, all of these made her a potential nucleus for future instability. As long as she lived, as long as she remained capable of speech and planning and the cultivation of grievances, she was dangerous. Not actively dangerous, perhaps, not an immediate threat, but an irritant, a possibility, a woman who had proven repeatedly that she could turn apparent defeat into renewed contest. The invitation was simple enough. Come to Denmark. You are old, you have suffered, you deserve rest. Harold offers you protection, comfort, the hospitality due to a queen of your stature. The past can be set aside. Let the wars of succession belong to the previous generation. Whether Gunnhild believed this offer was sincere, we cannot know. Perhaps she did. Perhaps after decades of struggle, the prospect of genuine rest was appealing enough to override her customary suspicion. Perhaps she calculated that Harold had more to gain from alliance than from murder, that her remaining sons and their claims could still be useful to Danish ambitions. Perhaps she simply had no better options and decided to take the chance, or perhaps she knew exactly what awaited her and went anyway. Perhaps she had finally run out of alternatives, finally recognized that the game was over, and chose to meet her ending directly rather than wait for it to find her in some cold Orkney hall. This is speculation. The sagas do not give us her inner thoughts. They give us only the fact of her journey and its conclusion. She crossed to Denmark. She was received, presumably, with the courtesies due her rank. And then, at some point, we do not know exactly when, we do not know exactly how, she was taken and drowned. Not killed in open conflict, not executed after public judgment, drowned, held beneath the waters of a bog until the breath left her and the body stilled. An old woman's death, anonymous and muffled, the kind of death designed to leave no witnesses and produce no revenge. The sagas record this with what can only be described as satisfied disapproval. Gunnhild was wicked, they seem to say. Gunnhild was dangerous. Her death was fitting. But there's also something else in the telling, something that reads almost like admiration for Harold Bluetooth's thoroughness. He saw a problem. He solved it. He eliminated a threat that more honorable methods might have failed to contain. The bog drowning was not noble, but it was effective. It was the kind of cold-eyed pragmatism that Gunnhild herself might have appreciated in other circumstances, directed at other targets. And yet, the sagas could not let her disappear entirely. Even as they recorded her ignoble death, they also recorded her story. They made her a central figure in the history of her age. They gave her speeches and stratagems. They made her, in their own way, immortal, preserved in exactly the literary tradition that was supposed to celebrate the men she had opposed. This is the final irony of the source material. The Christian authors who wrote down the sagas disapproved of Gunnhild. They considered her a villain, a witch, a warning. But they could not bring themselves to leave her out. She was too compelling, too important, too large to ignore. The question that remains, the question that the sources pose but cannot answer, is whether Gunnhild herself would have considered her life a success. By any external measure, she failed. She lost Norway, she lost her husband, she lost her sons one after another to the violence of their chosen profession. She died unmourned in a foreign bog, an old woman far from home, killed by treachery at the hands of a man who should have been her ally. Her line continued. Some of her descendants would later appear in Norwegian and Icelandic genealogies, but the great project of her life, the restoration of Eric's dynasty to permanent Norwegian power, came to nothing. The kingdom passed to other hands and other lineages. The house she had spent 40 years defending dissolved into the general aristocratic soup of medieval Scandinavian politics. But perhaps success is the wrong frame. Perhaps the question is not whether she won, but whether she mattered. And there, the answer is unambiguous. She mattered enormously. She mattered to the people who served her and the people who feared her. She mattered to the sons she raised and the rivals she destroyed. She mattered to the political history of Norway, to the survival of Icelandic settlement, to the shape of Scandinavian Christianity, to the development of saga literature itself. She mattered because she refused to become invisible, because she demanded to be reckoned with, because she made herself into the kind of figure that history cannot ignore even when it disapproves. The physical facts of her existence have long since vanished. If her body was truly consigned to a Danish bog, it may still be there somewhere, preserved, like the famous bog bodies of Iron Age Scandinavia, by the unique chemistry of the peat. This is unlikely. Most bog burials dissolve over time. Most secrets the earth keeps, it keeps permanently. But the image persists. Gunnhild, the witch queen, the kingmaker, the mother of kings, lying somewhere beneath Danish soil, her face turned toward the water that killed her story refusing to end. We have now traced her entire trajectory, the Finnmark origins, real or invented, the marriage to Eric, the joint rule in Norway and its collapse, the years in Orkney and England, the return, the brief restoration, the long decline, the final journey to Denmark, and the bog that waited at its end. We have examined her sons, her enemies, her methods, her reputation. We have considered the sources and their biases, the historiographical problems and their implications. We have tried to see her as clearly as the fragmentary evidence allows. But there is one more task remaining. We must consider her legacy, not her literary legacy, which we have already discussed, but her historical legacy. What did Gunnhild's existence mean for the world she inhabited? What would have been different if she had never lived, or had lived differently? What traces did she leave in the material and political structures of medieval Scandinavia? The first and most obvious trace is dynastic. Gunnhild's descendants, though they never regained the Norwegian throne, remained significant figures in the broader Norse world. Several of her grandchildren appear in Icelandic genealogies connected to important settler families who had fled Norway during the conflicts of the 10th century. The blood of Eric Bloodaxe and Gunnhild Konungamódr flowed through the veins of Saga Age Icelanders, linking the island's leading families to the royal struggles of the previous century. This was not accidental. The Icelandic aristocracy carefully preserved these connections, recorded them in genealogies, used them to establish their own legitimacy and prestige. To be descended from Eric and Gunnhild was to carry a specific kind of weight, a specific kind of claim to significance. The second trace is political. Gunnhild's decades of activity helped shape the conflicts that eventually produced a unified Norwegian kingdom. Her resistance to Håkon the Good and Håkon Sigurdsson, her manipulation of succession politics, her fostering of ongoing civil conflict, all of these contributed to the long, violent process by which Norway moved from a collection of regional chieftaincies toward something resembling centralized monarchy. She was not trying to build that monarchy. She was trying to control it, or failing that, to prevent others from controlling it. But the unintended consequences of her actions echoed through subsequent generations. The third trace is cultural. Gunnhild's story became part of the saga tradition, one of the central narratives through which medieval Icelanders understood their own past and the past of the Scandinavian world they had left behind. She was not merely recorded, she was mythologized, transformed into a literary archetype that influenced how subsequent authors portrayed powerful women. The witch queen, the manipulating mother, the power behind the throne. These figures recur throughout medieval Norse literature, and many of them bear Gunnhild's fingerprints. She did not invent the archetype, but she gave it particular force and particularity. She showed what it could look like when enacted by a real historical figure in real historical circumstances. And the fourth trace is the hardest to quantify, but perhaps the most important. Gunnhild demonstrated that a woman could matter in her own right, could shape events through her own agency, could refuse the passive roles her society prescribed. She did this without rejecting her society's frameworks. She worked within them, manipulated them, bent them to her purposes. She was a mother, a wife, a queen, all the traditional roles. But she made those roles into instruments of power rather than constraints upon it. She showed that the same categories that were supposed to contain women could also be wielded by them. This does not make her a hero. It does not make her admirable. Her methods were often cruel. Her goals were narrowly dynastic. She seems to have had no concern for anyone beyond her immediate family and their interests. The people who died in her son's campaigns, the rivals she allegedly had murdered, the communities disrupted by the wars she helped perpetuate, none of them benefited from her agency. Her power was power over, not power for. She expanded her own freedom by constraining others, but history is not a morality play. Significance is not the same as virtue. Gunnhild matters not because she was good, but because she was consequential. She matters because she occupied a space that was not supposed to exist, because she exercised influence that was not supposed to be available, because she persisted through circumstances that should have destroyed her. She matters because she was, in her own dark way, extraordinary. The bogs of Denmark are quiet now. The peat has long since forgotten what it received in the late 10th century, an old woman's body consigned to its waters by the cold pragmatism of Harald Bluetooth. The kingdoms Gunnhild fought over have merged into the nations of modern Scandinavia. The religion she saw arrive in her lifetime has been the dominant faith for 1,000 years. The language in which her story was recorded has become a scholarly specialty, studied in universities by people who have never seen a longship or heard a skald recite. Everything has changed, everything is unrecognizable, and yet the story survives, the name survives. Gunnhild Konungamadr, mother of kings, wife of Eric Bloodaxe, witch queen of Norway, the most feared woman of her age. She lost, she died in a bog, killed by treachery, stripped of everything she had spent her life building. She should have been forgotten. She should have dissolved into the silence that claimed so many of her contemporaries, men and women alike. She refused. The sagas remember her because the Icelanders who wrote them down 3 centuries later could not forget her. She had become, by then, not quite a person but something larger, a name that carried its own gravity, a figure around whom other figures arranged themselves. When the saga authors needed a queen who could stand against kings, they reached for Gunnhild. When they needed a mother whose ambition consumed everything it touched, they reached for Gunnhild. When they needed a woman who embodied the dangerous possibilities of female power in a masculine world, they reached for Gunnhild. She had become a vocabulary, a set of possibilities, a warning and an invitation wrapped together. This is what survival looks like for the very few. The bog does not remember. The peat is neutral, indifferent, a medium that preserves or does not preserve according to chemistry and chance. Somewhere in Denmark, we do not know where, Gunnhild's body entered that medium. Whether anything of it remains, whether some fragment of bone or preserved tissue still lies beneath the fields of Jutland, we cannot say. The archaeological record has not yielded her. Perhaps it never will. Perhaps there is nothing left to yield. The process is not guaranteed, and not every body consigned to the bogs achieves the strange immortality of preservation. Most simply decompose, most simply vanish. She vanished. But the name did not vanish. The story did not vanish. The Icelanders, writing in a language she would have recognized, though an alphabet she would not, kept her alive in the only medium that matters across deep time, narrative. They made her a character in their own literary project, the vast web of interconnected stories that we call the sagas. She appears in Egil's saga and Njal's saga and Heimskringla and the shorter King's sagas and the legendary sagas and the family sagas, a figure of consistent menace and consistent fascination. She is always the same, and never quite the same, each author shaping her to his purposes, emphasizing different aspects, inventing or suppressing according to the needs of his particular narrative. The consistency is remarkable. Across centuries of composition, across multiple independent textual traditions, the core Gunnhild remains stable. The beautiful and dangerous queen, the mother of violent sons, the practitioner of arts that good Christians were supposed to reject, the woman who never stopped fighting for her family's position, even when that fighting produced catastrophe. The saga authors did not coordinate. They worked from inherited material, oral traditions that had been circulating for generations before anyone wrote them down. The fact that their portraits align suggests that there was a real person beneath the literary construction, a historical Gunnhild, whose actions and reputation were dramatic enough to survive the long transmission from event to page. The literary Gunnhild is, of course, exaggerated. The cider accusations are almost certainly embroidered, possibly invented entirely. The tales of her seducing and murdering men in Finnmark, of her sending magical storms against enemies, of her cursing those who crossed her, these belong to the realm of literary convention, not historical testimony. They tell us more about what 12th and 13th century Icelanders believed about powerful women than about what Gunnhild actually did in the 10th century. But underneath the embroidery, something historical persists. The broad outlines of her life, her marriage to Eric, her time in Norway, her years in England, her return after Eric's death, her long presence in Denmark, her death. These elements appear consistently and correlate with what we know from other sources. The Anglo-Saxon chronicles confirm Eric's time in Northumbria and his death. Irish annals and continental sources provide fragments that align with the saga accounts. Archaeology has revealed the material world in which Gunnhild moved. The hall complexes, the grave goods, the ship burials, the networks of trade and communication that connected the North Sea world. She was real. Her story was real. What we cannot know is which details were real, which were plausible inference, and which were pure invention. This uncertainty is not a defect to be remedied. It is the condition of the knowledge. When we speak of Gunnhild, we speak of a figure who exists in the gap between history and literature, neither fully one nor fully the other. She is recoverable only through texts that blend memory with imagination, that use narrative conventions to shape historical material, that serve literary and political purposes, even as they claim to record the past. We cannot separate what happened from what the authors wanted to have happened, what Gunnhild was from what she was useful for being. This is not nothing. It is, in fact, the norm for most of human history. The documentary certainty that modern people have come to expect, photographs, recordings, contemporary accounts by multiple independent witnesses, this is a recent development, a product of the last 2 centuries at most. For most of human history, for most humans who ever lived, the past arrives the way Gunnhild's past arrives, fragmented, mediated, shaped by the needs of those who transmitted it. We work with what we have. We acknowledge its limitations. And we proceed, carefully, toward whatever partial truth remains accessible. The partial truth of Gunnhild is this: she mattered. She mattered to the political history of Norway because her marriage to Eric Bloodaxe placed her at the center of the most violent succession struggle of the 10th century. She mattered because she bore the sons who continued that struggle for decades after Eric's death, spreading the conflict across 2 generations and ensuring that no stable settlement could emerge. She mattered because her presence in Denmark gave Harald Bluetooth a tool to use against the Norwegian kings, a rival claim he could deploy or suppress according to his own strategic needs. She mattered because her death removed that tool and helped stabilize a political situation that her existence had helped destabilize. She mattered to the literary history of medieval Scandinavia because she became the template for a particular kind of powerful woman, the queen who rules through her husband, the mother who fights through her sons, the woman who uses beauty and cunning and allegedly darker arts to achieve what direct action cannot. This template influenced how later saga authors portrayed other women, both historical and fictional. It shaped expectations and created possibilities. When an author needed a powerful female figure, Gunnhild showed what that figure might look like, how she might act, what limits she might exceed. She mattered to the religious history of the North because she stood at the transition point between the old ways and the new. Her husband died a pagan, or perhaps a nominal Christian, killed by forces aligned with the Christian King of England and subsequently converted to the faith. Her sons oscillated between the religions according to political advantage. Her own beliefs are unrecoverable. The satyr accusations may reflect actual practice, may reflect literary convention, may reflect Christian authors' desire to demonize a figure who was already villainous in their sources. What is clear is that she lived through the conversion and did not survive it. Her death at the hands of Harold Bluetooth was the death of a figure associated with the pre-Christian order, whatever her actual beliefs. The Christian king removed the pagan queen. The new religion buried the old. And she mattered to the history of women's power because she exercised forms of influence that were not supposed to be available. She was not a ruling queen in her own right. No Scandinavian woman held that title in the 10th century. She was not a regent. Her sons were adults when Eric died, capable of ruling themselves. She was not a priestess or a law speaker or a military commander. She held no formal position that would justify her prominence in the sources. And yet she appears everywhere. She is present in every major scene of her sons' lives. She advises, counsels, encourages, allegedly incites. She accompanies them into exile and back out of it. She is named where other wives and mothers are nameless, specified where others are generic. The saga authors, whatever their biases and inventions, clearly believed that Gunnhild was important, not as a symbol or a type, but as an agent, a person who did things rather than merely appearing in scenes where things happened. This is the most enduring trace she left, the demonstration that such agency was possible. The constraints on women in Viking Age society were real and severe. The legal codes gave women few rights. The inheritance systems favored men. The political structures were built around male warriors and male rulers. The religious systems, both pagan and Christian, placed men at the center of ritual and authority. Everything about the society that Gunnhild inhabited told women that their roles were supporting ones, that they could influence through men, but not act independently of them. Gunnhild did not reject this framework. She could not have done so and survived. Instead, she mastered it. She understood that the role of queen, properly exploited, could become a position of genuine power. She understood that the role of mother, especially mother of potential kings, could transform a woman from dependent to indispensable. She understood that the informal channels, advice, persuasion, reputation, fear, could accomplish what formal authority could not. She was not unique in this understanding. Other women of her era and earlier eras grasped the same possibilities, exploited the same channels, achieved their own forms of influence. What made Gunnhild distinctive was the scale of her operation and the length of her persistence. From the 930s to the 970s, through 4 decades of political upheaval, through exile and return and exile again, through the deaths of her husband and most of her sons, she remained a factor. She adapted, she survived, she refused to accept the obsolescence that defeat was supposed to impose. The refusal is the heart of it. Other women in similar positions, widowed queens, mothers of failed claimants, exiles from lost kingdoms, accepted the reduced circumstances. They remarried, or they entered convents, or they retired into private obscurity. They made their peace with what had happened and ceased to be historical actors. This was the normal, expected, reasonable response to the kind of losses Gunnhild experienced. Her husband was dead. Her sons kept dying. Her claims kept failing. The sensible response was to stop claiming. She did not stop. The sagas record her, year after year, decade after decade, still scheming, still advising, still present at the center of her sons' affairs. Harold Greycloak's reign was her project. His diplomatic marriage was her negotiation. His campaigns were conducted with her counsel. When he fell, she did not fall with him. She transferred herself to Denmark, attached herself to Harold Bluetooth, continued her operations from a new base. She was 70 years old, perhaps older. She had been fighting for 40 years. She kept fighting. This is either admirable or monstrous, depending on what one values. If one values persistence, endurance, the refusal to accept defeat, then Gunnhild embodies those qualities at the highest level. She never quit. She never surrendered. She pursued her family's interests with a consistency that bordered on obsession and outlasted circumstances that would have broken most people of either sex. But if one values the costs of that persistence, the lives lost in her sons' campaigns, the communities devastated by the wars she helped perpetuate, the rivals killed by methods the sagas attribute to her cunning or her sorcery, then Gunnhild embodies something darker. Her refusal to accept defeat meant that others kept paying the price of her ambition. Her persistence extended the conflicts that might otherwise have ended. Her survival came at the expense of others' survival. The sagas do not choose between these readings, they present both. They show the magnificent, terrifying queen who never surrendered and the cruel, scheming woman who caused immense suffering. They do not reconcile the contradiction because the contradiction cannot be reconciled. Gunnhild was both things. Her virtues and her vices were the same qualities viewed from different angles. This moral complexity is why she endures. Simple villains fade into stereotype. Simple heroes fade into hagiography. Gunnhild resists both fates because she cannot be simplified. The more closely one examines her, to the extent that examination is possible given our sources, the more one finds irreducible tension. She was a mother who loved her sons enough to spend 4 decades fighting for their advancement, and she was a mother whose love expressed itself in ways that killed those sons and many others. She was a queen who exercised influence far beyond the normal limits of her position, and she was a queen whose influence consistently produced catastrophe. She was a survivor whose survival demonstrated extraordinary capability, and she was a survivor whose survival depended on the deaths of those less capable or less ruthless than herself. The bog at Aalborg, if that is indeed where Harold Bluetooth had her drowned, received a woman who contained all of these contradictions. The peat did not resolve them. Time has not resolved them. The millennium that has passed since her death has not produced consensus on who she was or what she meant. She remains as she was in life, contested and uncontainable. The wind still blows across the fens of Jutland. The fields that were once bogs have mostly been drained now, converted to farmland, plowed and planted and harvested in cycles that would have been unimaginable in the 10th century. The longships are gone. The hall complexes are ruins or less than ruins, traces visible only to the trained archaeological eye. The religion has changed, the language has changed, the political units have changed. Everything that Gunnhild knew has been erased or transformed beyond recognition. But the stories persist. In libraries and archives across Scandinavia, in university collections from Reykjavik to Copenhagen to Oslo, the manuscripts that preserve her memory still exist. Parchment and vellum, handwritten in scripts that modern readers must be trained to decipher, containing within their pages the narrative of the woman who was called Mother of Kings. Students still read about her, scholars still debate her, writers still invoke her when they need a figure who embodies the dangerous possibilities of female power in a world not built for female power. She would not have understood any of this. She could not have imagined that her story would outlast not only her, but her sons, her grandsons, the entire dynasty she spent her life serving. She could not have imagined that the language in which she was remembered would become an academic specialty, that the sagas would be translated into dozens of languages she never heard of, that her name would appear on websites and in podcasts and in media that would have seemed like magic to her. But then, she was supposed to be a witch. Perhaps magic would not have surprised her. The irony is that her survival, her literary survival, the only kind available across such spans of time, was accomplished by the very people who condemned her. The Christian saga authors who shaped her into a villain, who attributed to her all the dark arts their religion taught them to fear, who made her the witch queen whose machinations brought suffering to Norway, they are the ones who preserved her. Without their disapproval, she would be nameless. Without their condemnation, she would be forgotten. They meant to make her a warning, and instead, they made her immortal. This is the deepest irony of Gunnhild's legacy. She won by losing. She survived by being killed. She achieved permanence through the very narratives that sought to diminish her. The saga authors gave her eternity while intending to give her judgment, and she has outlasted them all, their names mostly lost, their individual contributions impossible to untangle, while she remains named and known and argued over 1,000 years after her body sank into Danish water. The Mother of Kings. It was a title, and it was a fate, and it was a prison, and it was her instrument of power. She bore sons, and she lost sons, and she kept fighting for sons who were already dead, for a cause that had already failed, for a dynasty that was already finished. She could not let go. She could not accept that the game was over. She played until Harold Bluetooth took the pieces away, and even then, even drowning in a bog at 70 years of age, she did not surrender. She simply stopped. The body ceased. The story continued. It is still continuing. It will continue after these words end, after the medium that carries them becomes obsolete, after the language shifts and the references need footnotes and the context requires explanation. Gunnhild Konunga Modir outlasted her world. She will outlast ours. The peat keeps its secrets. The sagas keep their queen. And somewhere beneath the fields of Denmark, in darkness that has lasted 10 centuries and will last 10 more, there may be nothing left of her at all, or there may be something, some fragment of bone or preservation waiting for a spade that will never come. It does not matter. She is not there anymore. She is here. In the manuscripts, in the libraries, in the syllabi, in the dissertations, in the documentaries, in the conversations that still invoke her name. She is here because she refused to be nowhere, because she fought until fighting was no longer possible, because she made herself so consequential that forgetting her was harder than remembering. The Witch Queen of Norway, the widow of Bloodaxe, the woman they drowned in a bog and could not silence. She is still speaking. Listen.